All right, good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait maybe another 30 seconds for people to connect and log in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Matt Tyska. I'm Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor in the Department of Cell and Developmental Biology here at Vanderbilt University. And as a scientist for the last 25 years, I've been investigating the basis of biological force generation and motion in systems like contracting muscle. This morning, I'm going to serve as moderator for the next installment of our monthly Lab to Table conversation. And this is a series of events hosted by Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, Basic Sciences. And these discussions have spanned a wide range of biomedical research topics. But today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to talk about the science of cycling, and we're excited to have with us three panelists from professional cycling community to discuss how science has impacted cycling in terms of training, nutrition, and also race performance over the last couple of decades. I just have a few housekeeping items before we move forward. I need to just give you a rundown of the agenda today. We're going to do about a 45-minute moderated conversation. After that, we'll have about 15 minutes of open Q&A, and you should be able to paste any questions you have into the chat. We can try and get through as many of those questions as we have time for. And I need to remind you also that this conversation is being recorded, and this eventually will show up on YouTube, and so you can spread the word for people who are not able to tune in right now. So with all that said, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to our panelists to provide a brief introduction of themselves, and maybe start out with George.
Yep, thanks for having me on. I'm George Hincapie. I was a professional cyclist for 19 years. I did 17 Tour de France's and 5 Olympic Games, and got to watch a lot of the change in the sport of cycling. You know, back in the day, it was just super rudimentary, basic, train as long and as hard as you can and eat as little as you can. Now it's obviously a lot more refined. There's a lot more data collection involved, and it's just been fun to watch the evolution of cycling. And even now, from when I stopped 9 years ago, I mean, the change has been super dramatic. So I'm actually interested as well to hear from Bobby and Kevin as well on how much the sport has changed since back in my time, because I know that just from what I've been hearing from a lot of my old peers in the peloton, it's just completely different training and the way people come at the sport. So I think it should be a fun panel. Thanks for having me on.
About Bobby?
Hi, my name is Bobby Julich. I retired in 2008 after 16 years as a professional. I've known George since he was 13 and I was 15, so it's kind of neat having him on this panel, but we're also neighbors. So a lot of the things that we discuss on our training rides is around you know, the new technology emerging in sports. So it's kind of fun because he has a son who's just getting into cycling, and we're trying to share that knowledge with him. We're trying to understand it ourselves, test it, play with it, break it. That's just kind of what we do nowadays. So yeah, I have my own coaching and consulting business, and also just recently started working for a company called Super Sapiens, which is super interesting. And yeah, just looking forward to being on this panel and learning something. Got to learn something every day.
Thanks. All right, Dr. Krauss.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Sprouse. I'm a sports medicine physician, and again, the least accomplished athlete in the room, which is usually the case for me. These guys are amazing. I just learned that George did 5 Olympics. That's impressive. So my background, I studied exercise physiology as an undergraduate student, got a degree in that, then went to med school, did a residency in emergency medicine. And then while doing that, got very interested in figuring out how I could bring my sports performance background into medicine. Ended up doing a fellowship in sports medicine, and then immediately started working in World Tour cycling almost 12 years ago now. And I've been with the EF team, or the various iterations of that team, through the years. So it was Garmin Sharp, it was Garmin Cervelo, It was Chipotle when I started working with them years ago. And so I've been in the sport now basically about 12 years, kind of for the last few years of George's career at least, and then in probably the decade or so since. My practice involves both work in the world tour, but also working with recreational athletes and athletes in other sports as well. And one of the things I love doing, like Bobby alluded to, is finding those cutting edge devices, tools, and tactics that we can employ. And a lot of them that come across my desk are kind of noisy and of questionable utility. And then we find some really golden ones here and there. And that's a fun pursuit. So that's kind of my day-to-day focus is on performance as well as the health of these athletes.
Great. Okay. Thanks the three of you for just telling us a little bit about where you're coming from. I thought I'd start with just a really broad question aimed primarily at Bobby and George. And if it's possible to put into words, could you tell us a little bit about the physical demands of a race like the Tour de France? You know, big multi-day stage race like that.
You want me to go first, Bobby?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you did 17 of them, so you know a little bit more about it than I do. So,
I mean, in terms of like the actual demands, it's very, very grueling, but it's a sort of a life-consuming thing. When you're racing a race like the Tour de France, you have nothing else going on. Your whole life is centered around how fast you can go on the bike, how quickly you can recover, what fuel you put into your body is going to make you the strongest. So in that terms, it's not just racing the Tour de France. The whole year is centered around, you know, arriving at a race like the Tour de France at your peak fitness. And it requires all of your energy, all of your time. It requires you to be super selfish. If you don't get to see your friends much, you get limited time with your family. It's all about training and recovering.
yeah, it seems like a lifetime ago because my last tour was in 2006. But the thing that I really remember, and I live a little bit vicariously through some friends and some people still in the peloton, is that, like George said, it's a very lonely lifestyle. You know, you're constantly just thinking about yourself and trying to get the best out of yourself. That being said, you know, technology has changed a lot. And from when George and I were young amateurs to middle-aged professionals, up until the day that we retired, everything was changing so fast. And now these kids, and I'll call them kids because I'm turning 50 this year, they were brought up with this. They just had it in their back pocket. And we really had to scratch and look for new things. And now these young riders just have all this from day one, which is pretty amazing. We always talk about, you know, when I was racing, or the old school way of doing things compared to the new school. But nowadays, if you're not totally informed with what's going on, or at least have some very, very smart people around you, you're going to be at a disadvantage.
Got it. So, you know, the race like the Tour, there are lots, it's not just the same thing day in, day out in terms of the terrain and the type of stage. I mean, you know, there are races in the mountains, there are time trials. Is there consensus on what the hardest stages are for the group, the peloton, or is this really going to depend on what kind of rider you are?
I think it definitely depends on what kind of rider you are, but everybody has to fight gravity. So I would say that the climbing stages are the hardest. A lot of the times it's very hot, you know, very, very stressful. Obviously, there's people that take those stages more seriously than others, but those were the ones that really started the pressure cooker for riders like myself. George?
Well, I would say it really just depends on the course. I mean, yes, typically the profile would tend to make it a much more difficult day in terms of calorie expenditure and the amount of power you have to put on the pedals. But the flat stages and the sort of the medium mountain stages where you have a lot of small roads, a lot of positioning involved, a lot of stress in the first week of the tour. There's a lot of danger, so there's a high possibility that you're going to crash. So you have the stages, the mountain stages, of course, are going to be hard, but those days when you don't really know who's going to win and everybody's got a real chance of winning, also, in my opinion, can make it really hard. And then you throw in wind and, like I said, small roads, it makes it for very tough, aggressive, stressful racing.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about what training was like. This is a question directed at Bobby and George. Early on in your careers versus later. You sort of alluded to that a little bit earlier, but maybe with a little bit more detail on how measurement and science sort of creeped in those later years.
Yeah, dating ourselves again. I kept a training log when I was very, very young, up most of my career, I think. And I was looking at it recently, and all it was hours and miles ridden. Then heart rate monitors came in, and there was the early adapters to that, and then the people that didn't really like it. And then the big real game changer was when the power meters came out. At the beginning, I think I bought my first one in 1999 from a company called SRM, which was the original power meter. And obviously there are many, many more brands now. Then data collection software programs, Training Peaks, Daily Plan, or Today's Plan, these were, all of a sudden online training diaries, and you could keep all your data in one place and make a little bit more sense of it. And now, it's just moving more and more towards that specificity around recovery, around nutrition, around glucose metabolism. So not many cyclists have fancy abbreviations or letters or numbers after their name, but they need to have people around them that have those qualifications.
Yeah, I would say something similar to where, like Bobby said early on, we just rode as much as we could and as hard as we could every day. Later on, we got tools like the SRMs and the Training Peaks where you're able to upload a lot of all of your training. We had to upload all of our training, but I feel like now there is a lot more interaction too between the rider and the coaches and the staff, the trainers, the nutritionists, in terms of knowing exactly how much energy they put in. I mean, you can get a schedule all day long, a weekly schedule, but you don't know how you're going to feel from one day to the next. So I think now they're a lot more in tune with how the riders are actually feeling on that day, and are able to adjust the training based on, how much the rider slept, how much he recovered. I think the amount of information now is even a lot greater than when Bobby and I stopped.
Okay, so so we talked a little bit about power measurement. Kevin, I'm hoping you can sort of broaden the conversation a little bit to tell us about what other kinds of metrics someone in your position might be interested in when it comes to monitoring riders' performance and health, especially during a big race like the Tour.
Yeah, I think kind of on the tail end of what George and Bobby said there, when they were younger in the sport, when I first got started in the sport, we had heart rate, we had power, and we had kind of subjective measures. And all those things are really important, but it was very difficult if a rider came to me or a director came to me and said, hey, this guy's not doing that well. He's not performing as we expected. Is he sick? Is there something going on? There was a lot of unknowns in terms of the variables. We would run some blood work, we would look for illnesses, but a lot of times you rule that stuff out and we're kind of left with resting heart rate response, and their power output. Nowadays, though, we're able to look at, how are they sleeping? How are they recovering from a neurologic standpoint? What does their glucose metabolism look like on and off the bike? How are they fueling? All of that was kind of a black box before. So if they're training or racing 4 hours a day, we were missing 20 hours of the day in what we could look at objectively. And we know scientifically and medically that patients or athletes recall these things. In other words, you ask them, what did you eat? How did you sleep? Their recall is suspect and bad, and that's for all of us. And so even though the subjective part's really important, now that we can look at their sleep, how much do they sleep? What was the quality of their sleep? How did they fuel? Bobby had mentioned glucose metabolism. we can put a 24-hour glucose monitor on them and see if they become hypoglycemic, if their blood sugar drops overnight, which is indicative that they probably didn't fuel enough the day before. So now we've got this trove of information that we can look at, and it's night and day from what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, so a lot of data flying around, it sounds like. I'm wondering, it's clear that you can use things like power, all these metrics that you're describing during training and even during racing. I'm wondering about other applications of this kind of data, like talent screening or selecting, trying to find individuals who are going to excel in cycling. To what extent are these kinds of metrics applied in that area, or are they? I mean, clearly, power output is going to be something that people are paying attention to, but how is talent selected?
These metrics are certainly applied, but they're not even, they're not necessary, and in a lot of ways, they're not even sufficient to tell if someone is likely to be a good talent. You think of things like VO2 max, you're measuring the aerobic engine, or lactate threshold, or some of the more traditional sports performance tests. And there's kind of like there's a rough minimum that someone needs to be able to meet, but we know that those numbers don't necessarily correlate with competitive results. And the same can be said whether you're looking at other measures of metabolism or heart rate variability, their resting heart rate. Like, it all tells you a little bit, but at the end of the day, I bet Bobby and George can, not that they'll name them here, but they can think of numerous athletes who had amazing engines that, if a race was run in a lab, they would have won every day, but you've never heard of them because they never succeeded. And that's the type of thing that is that intangible of being a competitor and having skills on the bike and being able to get to the finish line first is unmeasurable. So I think it's important to kind of put into the correct context and put into its place where data is helpful, but also what it can't do for you.
Got it. Okay. What I'm wondering is, from the perspective of a normal person or someone who's an amateur athlete, they have their own perception of what exertion is like, what performance is like, and what their own peak performance looks like. But, it would be interesting to hear from you guys about standout performances and, where is the limit of power output during a sprint or a time trial? Are there any standout performances or individuals that you can think of who really physiologically, when it comes to power output or VO2 max, things like that, are just exceptional? Can you bring that into the conversation? Could be any of the panelists.
Well, I'll take a stab at that one. I mean, obviously, power is a big thing. VO2 max is a big thing. But riding with George and his young son, Enzo, George constantly tells him about finesse and how to save energy in the peloton. And I think that does mean a lot. And I think it's great that George is passing that sort of knowledge on to his son and the other young riders that we come into contact with, because for me, the Zwift indoor training platform is a game changer. It's amazing technology, but it's also really narrowed it down to people only concentrating on power output and not the technical abilities, not the tactical abilities that they need to perhaps work on as well to be successful in this sport. But as far as limits go, I mean, I'd have to say these last couple of years have just blown our models out of the water. When we were doing some heavy work into this subject in like 2011 and 2012, I think those numbers have gone up. And why? I think riders are just better trained, better nourished, have a lot more emphasis on their mental health. There's a lot of teams that have sports psychologists now. These were all things that we didn't even really think of, because cycling is very much a blue collar, hard-nosed sport. But the numbers I would love to see is mostly from the track, this last Olympics, Filippo Ganna from Italy. They won the gold medal in the team pursuit. And we hear the power and that these guys are putting out and the gear selection that they're using. And it's just phenomenal. Like where is the limit? Like we used to think in the team pursuit that, 4 minutes was a really fast time. And now they're doing it in 3:40 or even faster. So I think that bar is constantly changing, and we're in for some pretty exciting times in the near future as far as athletic performance is concerned on the bike.
So it sounds like some of these things are if performance keeps improving, that some of these things, by applying the measurement and metrics, are actually trainable. Is that what one should take away, that we could continue to push performance further and further?
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
that's kind of the point of the training, is to figure out where the novel places to go are, right? And so one of the things that we see with power is, when I came into the sport 10, 12 years ago, a lot of the riders avoided the weight room. It was something that was thought that it would put on weight and it would be a detriment to their training. And now you see many more cyclists using weight training, a simple intervention, and something that other sports have been using for years, but maybe our sport was a little late to the game in that respect. But then you get these young kids who are used to being in the weight room and doing more of the more appropriate training, not to put on mass, but to increase strength and power. And then that starts to manifest on the track and on the road. And so where maybe our sport has had a bit of a head start and been very good at developing aerobic capacity and VO2 max and what's going to carry you long distances, now we're getting better at figuring out the power output and how to really raise the threshold of what they're able to do. So as George was telling his son, it's important where you spin that power, where you kind of burn your matches, as we say. If now you've got a bigger match book and matches that are stronger, and you've got the ability to go the distance, then those things start to all come together and performance goes up.
So I have a question for George and Bobby, and it's really, coming back to this idea of having all this data. Knowledge is power. Clearly there could be, if you know that your power numbers, for example, are looking good, there could be a psychological advantage to you during a race. But I'm wondering, is that also used in, is there trash talking going on essentially in the peloton using that information, or is that really information that's held close to the chest, so to speak, and protected?
I wouldn't say there was much trash talk amongst your competition, but definitely with your teammates and your friends. If you're feeling good, or you're on a training ride together and you're doing these intervals, there was definitely, I remember like Ryder Hesjedal, he was like the king of that. He's like 7 watts per kilo, man. But no, not so much in between like riders on different teams, but friends for sure. There'd be some trash talking going on. And Bobby J and I, of course, to this day, we do it all the time. And we're doing a big ride this weekend, and I'm going to be talking some serious trash to him about midway into this 100-mile gravel ride.
Excellent.
I have a funny story about that. I think at the beginning, when not all the riders were using power meters or understanding their data, there was a lot of trash talking. I remember in particular this one team that was very dominant in the Tour de France. They were riding tempo on the climb, and a rider attacked, and this one of the head kind of workers on the team just yelled at him like, we're going our threshold right now, so we'll see you in 2 to 3 minutes. And man, that kid that was attacking, when he heard that, and then he looked back and he saw that this team was just riding tempo on the front at their threshold. You can only stay over your threshold on those long climbs for so long. And he came back into the bunch, and it was like the walk of shame. So that trash talking did get into the riders' heads, especially at the beginning when maybe it wasn't totally across the board with the knowledge. But now I doubt many people would yell something like that again. But that in particular story was a real eye opener that, man, if you don't have this knowledge and if you do go against the grain, it's simple math for a lot of these guys now as far as looking at their power.
That's interesting. Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit and ask Kevin about the stresses on the body during a long race like the Tour, and things like the immune system and how the immune system might soak up that stress, or are there active measures that one can take to minimize the impact on one's health during a race like that?
Yeah, the effort in a race like the Tour de France in particular, it really does impact the immune system. If we look just at the immune system, we know that even after something like a marathon or a 100-mile gravel race, or a single big day, there is a temporary decline in immune function. It may be hours, it may be a day or so. The studies they're not really clear exactly how long it lasts or to what degree it is. And I think there's a reason why that clarity is not there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we know that it exists. So there's this period of time after the effort where an athlete is more prone to illness, potentially. At the Tour, and at any Grand Tour, and even week-long stage races, it's pretty common to see people being, even before COVID, being very conscious of hygiene, washing their hands constantly, maybe not shaking hands with people, keeping a bit of a distance, because they know there's that immune suppression. And then you look at that day after day after day, you end up in a position where potentially the immune system is depressed for 3 full weeks, and after the race. I think some of that uncertainty into this effect probably comes from the fact that there's many inputs into what makes the immune system strong. So if a rider comes in well tapered, kind of well recovered for the race, if their nutrition is good during the race, that may limit the degree to which the immune system is depressed. If they sleep well, there's all kinds of inputs to that. So you can't just focus on the effort, the output, and then the immune function. That's too myopic. But one of the things that we've seen is when we do start to focus on sleep, metrics of recovery, nutrition. We were one of the first teams to travel with a chef so that we could avoid the hotel food, which is both lacking in terms of nutrients, but also we don't have control over the hygiene that went into the preparation of that food. So we brought a chef, and we have great vegetables and good quality food. We can control the preparation. And I think for the last 3 years at the Tour de France, at least, we've not had anyone leave with sickness, which at the beginning of my time in the sport, it was pretty typical that 1 or 2 guys in every Grand Tour would leave with a head cold or a stomach bug or something. And so as we've been able to focus on those things that are important to all of us, whether we're riding the Tour de France or not, sleep, nutrition, recovery, and really dial it in for our athletes, we see improvement in the immune outcomes. So even though it's a huge potential problem, I think it's one that we can mediate to some degree.
Interesting. So you touched on nutrition a few times there. I'm hoping maybe George and Bobby could tell us a little bit about eating on the bike during a race and how that evolved, again, during the extent of your careers.
Bobby, you want to go?
I'd like to hear your answer first.
Okay, so yeah, back in the day, it was just like Belgian butter cakes. I mean, it was like very, very basic nutrition. I mean, that's gotten a lot more refined. I feel like, and I'm sure Kevin can speak to this, is like they're training themselves to be able to absorb more carbohydrates per hour than we ever did. The nutrition is 100% more dialed in now than back in our day. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think it was basically copy and paste nutrition across the board. Everybody ate the same thing. Everybody had the same thing in their musette bags, which are the little bags that we grab when we're going through the feed zones during bike races. And there really wasn't any thought into that. It was just like, hey, what tasted good? But from a very young age, my father was one of the first distributors of power bars. So from a very young age, I would eat power bars when a lot of my friends were eating turkey sandwiches or Snickers bars. And that was something that just kind of kept with me all the way through my entire career, was, you know, looking at nutrition a little bit differently. I wasn't one to really weigh my food or really break it down, but nowadays there's so many great products out there, and we have the ability to look and see what these foods that we put in our body actually do to ourselves. You know, every time you eat, you know, food is broken down into glucose. Glucose is fuel, and fuel is energy. And now, instead of it being a guessing game, it's very individualized when you can wear this technology of the continuous glucose monitor, and really see what foods spike you and, you know, maybe cause a big crash afterwards, or what foods give you that more sustainable energy. And I really think that this is the future as far as endurance sports goes, because we've always kind of guessed what works for us, or, you know, you go to a nutritionalist and it's basically the same exact thing that they say to everybody. And now you can actually curate your own feed bag and eat what works for you, and to, you know, in order to get the best performance out of yourself. And I think back to some of the teams that I was on that I even worked with, and certain products have different responses for different people. So if I was involved, you know, bossing a world tour team now, of course you need to have sponsors, but like I would definitely test these foods to see if there are any outliers, people that just don't respond well to them, and then maybe not give them an exemption to use a different product. So the technology is there, but we're talking about another data stream that is quite confusing. Even the biggest, best, most accredited nutritionalists and sports scientists in the world don't know every answer about glucose metabolism. But I think little by little, we're going to get there, and people are going to make better choices.
Okay, so maybe back to Kevin here, just to follow up on that. The idea that we have a power meter on the bike, and we can measure mechanical work, the work that the rider is generating. There's fuel coming in the form of nutrition. You know, how is that? Is there a calculation there that's done during races that actually try to match fuel input with work output, or is the rider always lagging behind in terms of the calories that they're taking in? I'm just wondering about that interface between, you know, mechanical work output and nutrition input.
Yeah. So the answer is both. You know, we're always doing that calculation, trying to figure out for the individual what they need on the bike and then for recovery. But it's a gap that you can never close. You can't, at the rate that these guys work on the bike over, call it 6 hours, they will inevitably end at a deficit. There's been some move to make that gap smaller. You know, some of the fueling strategies and some of the foods that are used help to do that. You know, if someone was taking in 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and now we get them up to 90 grams per hour because of the ability to tolerate the diet or a novel type of carbohydrate, then that makes a big dent in that, but they'll still finish at a deficit. And that's what we try to rectify between stages, you know, with recovery meals and dinner and those things. But, you know, as George and Bobby talked about earlier in their career, the foods were a bit more basic. Even if it was the power bar, you know, that was better than a sandwich or a roll, but it wasn't closing that gap sufficiently. And now we even have carbohydrates that are engineered to be more digestible and deliver more calories per serving, basically. whether that's a company like Morton or Scratch has its cluster dextrin, which really ups the game. So it makes it so that deficit's less, but it's still there. And then we look at things like physiologic testing, lactate testing, and various algorithms into which you can put the lactate measurements and determine, for a given effort, a given wattage, is a rider burning, X number of calories and fat versus carbohydrate. We call it substrate utilization. Then as the effort gets harder and harder, they burn more carbs as opposed to fat. And so it's almost like if you think of the body as a hybrid, at a given effort, you're draining so much from one tank and so much from the other. And so then we start to bring that data in too, and it gets to be pretty complicated. So the point is, we can make those calculations and we can get pretty scientific with the input, but you can never totally win the equation. At the end of the day, you still got to have a big dinner and do some of the basics.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm starting to think about some of the really long, monster one-day races. George, you were always great at the spring classics. I'm thinking about Paris-Roubaix. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about, especially in terms of nutrition and the kinds of things that you would eat to just stay on the bike during, how many hours is Paris-Roubaix? It's over 6 hours, I think, right?
Yeah, sometimes up to 7 hours or more, depending on the weather. But yeah, I'm sure it's probably different now, but the night before, just eat as much carbohydrates as you could, 3-4 plates of pasta or rice, a little bit of protein, and then same sort of thing for breakfast, a lot of carbs, a little bit of protein, and then just start eating it as quickly as you can into the race, 30 to 60 minutes in, and eat every 30 minutes along the way. Obviously, sometimes your stomach can't handle it, or you forget to eat because the racing is going on full gas, but you try to anticipate when you're going to be going hard and try to get the calories in before you're actually going full gas on the bike. But constantly reminding yourself to eat in a race like Paris-Roubaix or Tour of Flanders, which in my opinion are the hardest one day, most caloric requirement out of any race on the calendar, just because you're constantly on the gas, either fighting for position, going on small roads, dodging crashes, or going up short, steep cobble climbs. It's the action is never ending. So when you get a moment to eat, you eat. If you get a little bit of downtime, you eat, and it's just like just as much as you can.
So at the end of a race like that, maybe we could talk a little bit about recovery. So in terms of, what do you do when you finish Paris-Roubaix? I mean, do you just start eating, or you lay in there in a coma for a while, or how does that work?
So it's a lot different, like Kevin was saying. I mean, in the stage race, it's obviously very, very important. One-day races, you're not racing. It's important, don't get me wrong, especially if you have a race 3-4 days later. But for me, Paris-Roubaix was always the end of my spring series. So I had to go have a burger and a couple of beers, which is the worst thing you can do. But if you're actually trying to recover for a workout the next day or stage the next day, it's a completely different, sort of requirement nutritionally.
Bobby or Kevin, can you expand on that? In terms of, what the recovery should look like, especially if you have to race the next day or soon after.
Yeah,
I'm not opposed to the burger and beer.
We'll go get one
Go
after.
ahead, Bobby.
We said, as a simple rule, eat before you're hungry and drink before you're thirsty. But fact is, like George said, racing dictates your focus on something such as fueling, which, when I say fueling, I mean eating and drinking, and both are very, very, very important to aerobic performance, especially. But when you're done with a hard race, one of the last things that you want to do is eat. Your stomach, you don't feel good. You're just kind of drained. You've been eating all day long, and you've been consuming so many carbohydrates that often you just don't want to eat anything. But now there's protocols in place, and maybe Kevin, being associated with a current World Tour team, you could share with us maybe the recovery protocols. But it's gotten a lot easier. I remember one of my first Grand Tours. I was on a French team, and we had baked potatoes and olive oil and salt. And I tell you, you have to have some mega morale to want to eat a baked potato with olive oil and salt after a stage of the Tour de France, or especially 3 weeks into that stage. But it was just, it wasn't, eating wasn't enjoyable. It was a task, and you knew that if you didn't eat, you wouldn't recover. If you didn't recover, you wouldn't perform. So I look back to so many of those calories, and it was just shoveling food in your mouth out of necessity rather than pleasure.
Yeah, the way we address it on the world tour is you have to take the science into account, but you also have to take the palatability of the diet into account and the morale of the rider. And so combining those, the way, just briefly, if you were to finish the stage of the Tour de France, immediately as you cross the line, you're going to be handed a recovery bottle by one of the soigneurs, and it's going to be mostly high carbohydrate, 30 grams of carbohydrate that is high glycemic, and we're taking advantage of a period of time, quote unquote window, that Matt, you probably know more about than me, but there's this short period of time after you finish where the muscles receptors, called these various GLUT receptors, are upregulated and can pull in the glucose you take in and restore that glycogen very quickly. And so we want to take advantage of that window, and then we want to start to get protein in. And so by the time they get back to the bus, they've finished the first bottle, hopefully. And then we'll start to get them maybe a protein drink, or there's going to be some real food there. So almost every team bus on the world tour now has a rice cooker. And in that rice cooker is obviously a big pot of rice, usually with some chicken, some eggs, soy sauce. So it's salty, there's protein, there's real food, there's something that kind of gives them, it's appetizing, and it'll change day to day. Occasionally there'll be burritos or sandwiches or something that fits the bill nutritionally, but is also something that is appetizing. And so hopefully by the time we get to the hotel, they've had carbohydrates, they've had protein, they've had some real food. And then when they're at the hotel, they're going to snack pretty much from the time they get there, through their massage, through chiropractic sessions, have dinner that the chef has prepared. And then usually the guys leave dinner and go to the food room where they grab another snack just before bed. So it's constant intake. The caloric burn during a stage is somewhere between 4,000 to 8,000, depending on the stage, the size of the rider, etc. And so that's a lot to get back in. And that's kind of how we put it together.
So we only have a few minutes left in the discussion before we move to the Q&A. I guess I just wanted to ask one last question, and really for any of the panelists, and it's about how technology is embraced sort of through the peloton. It sounded like early on, adoption was definitely not 100%, and there was people who had access to those numbers during races, wattage output, and people who didn't. Now, I mean, how do young riders view the technology? Is it complete 100% integration with all of these metrics, or are they just relying on someone else, a team doctor, to tell them what to do? How does that work?
I think it definitely depends on the individual. No doubt there's people that want to know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and I strongly support that. The issue is we are giving athletes so many things to think about that they often just want that flashbang, immediate success or immediate performance advantage. And so much of these things now, you have to take the time. It's not like a magic sprinkle dust. It's going to be something that you really have to invest time in. So I think we have to be a little bit careful with riders. I see them jumping from rock to rock very often. And it's just like, man, get on your rock, really learn about that rock instead of just looking, at every direction to jump onto another rock, because, then you just get frustrated because you're never really giving a data set the true time that it deserves to understand it and use it and hopefully benefit from it.
Kevin, do you have anything to add there? Or? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd agree entirely with that. That it's very individual. There are some athletes still who have very little interest in the data and the numbers. And so often that work is kind of done in the background between the coach and the various members of the performance staff. But I'd say more and more, it's the norm that the athletes are interested in the numbers. And to Bobby's point, sometimes too interested, almost, following one new tech to the next. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out that we will employ and test that ends up being more noisy than signal when it comes to the utility of it. And so we try to do that also a bit in the background and vet it separately, because it's a real problem to have it, to steal an athlete's focus in that way. But I will say, I think today, as opposed to 10 years ago, there are more athletes who are interested in the numbers, whereas there was much more, when I came into the sport, there was a feeling that it was just about the sensations and how you felt. And I don't want to wear a heart rate strap. I don't care about the power meter. And I think there's some good in that too. You have to have both. And there's even good studies to show that your objective data and your subjective data are probably about 50-50 on par with each other in terms of utility. But I do feel like nowadays there's more acceptance of the tech and the numbers.
Awesome. Okay. So hopefully at this point, we can try to switch to the Q&A. We have a number of questions queued up. Panelists, can you see the questions? Is one question. You actually see the questions?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. And so I will just put it in your hands. If you see a question that you feel like you can answer, I would say go for it. We've got quite a few in there now.
I'm happy to take that first one about blood tests and what we check for a rider's health. So it's a fairly lengthy panel, but the short version is every probably 6 to 9 weeks, we'll check blood counts. We'll look at chemistry, so look at measures of electrolytes, blood sugar. We'll look at measures of muscle damage, creatine kinase, sometimes LDH. We'll look at hormone levels, so testosterone and cortisol, one being an anabolic hormone, one being catabolic, and see how that balances. The important thing to recognize is none of these are the be all end all. None of them are solely predictive of anything. We look at iron status, we look at vitamin D, but the important thing is to establish a baseline and then recognize deviation from that baseline. The follow-up question in there was supplementation. If we recommend supplements for any reason, it's typically because of something we see in the blood work, not just saying, oh, well, every endurance athlete needs iron. Instead, we check and we see if they need it. And if they do, we find a reputable source that is third-party tested. Oftentimes on our team, we've done our own testing beyond that, batch testing to ensure purity. So we're pretty cautious with it. But the key is to establish a baseline and then look for deviation from that baseline, as opposed to looking at absolute values.
Okay, who wants to go next? We've got quite a list here. Bobby, you see anything?
Yeah, I like this one here because I think my answer will be quite funny. Amateur cyclists here, what are your go-to food snacks on a 40 to 50 mile ride? This has definitely changed over the years. I would say that I ate so many darn bars and gels during my career that I like to keep it a little bit more simple. I bonked off my face with 2 power bars in my back pocket. So I like to have things that I want to eat. And really, I'm just looking for carbohydrates, sugar. So I ride with George quite often. And one of my favorite things are the little waffle cookies. We had them in Europe. They're the Stupin waffle cookies. But now I get them from Lidl, a pack of 10 for like $2. Shove those in my pocket. Those are always great because I want to eat it. Or organic Pop-Tarts from Trader Joe's. I know that's not the most nutritional thing. And when I pull these out, George would be, what are you doing eating a Pop-Tart? And I'm like, well, I just need sugar right now. And this is the way I'm going to put it in, instead of eating something less enjoyable like a power bar. So yeah, those are my favorite little snacks. And Haribo gummies, little gummy bears from the dollar store, the ones that have the real sugar. I like to have those in case I need to try to pop old George going up one of the climbs right at the end of the ride, or immediately after the ride for recovery.
So I got one too. The thoughts on Pogachar's Fanta chugging at the end of the finish line. I know that was always my go-to drink when I was the last several years of my career, and it was something about like the last 10 miles of a race, a really hot day. The only thing I can think about was like a cold carbonated sweet drink, and Fanta was the go-to thing. But our German doctor would always say it actually had like phosphates in it that helped, I don't know, get rid of, or something with lactic acid. Doc, is there any validity to that or not?
Probably not. I mean, you could, if there was enough of a dose of it, you could probably make a physiologic case for the benefit. But I think the biggest benefit there is really you're getting a little bit of hydration, something you enjoy, and a big slug of sugar, which is what your body needs right there.
Yeah.
And you'll see Peter Sagan is famous for the Haribo as well, the gummies, and always just pounding a bag of those. He was also famous for having a beer after every stage, which I saw frequently with him. And so I think it's really whatever tastes good to you and gets the process of glycogen recovery going quickly.
Kevin, I was hoping maybe I could put in a plug for the question from Mark DeCasticker about potential adverse effects on the cardiovascular system. You've heard about people who've been endurance racing, either running or riding for long periods of time during their life, and arrhythmias popping up and that kind of thing. What's the current state of thinking on those issues?
Yeah, so this is a timely question. I'm actually dealing with paroxysmal AFib myself for the last 7 or 8 months. Not to say that it's directly due to my endurance exercise, but we don't know. So the underlying part of the question here is there's been first a recognition that arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation are starting to be seen with increasing frequency in lifelong endurance athletes. At first, we weren't sure if it was increasing frequency, or are we just diagnosing it more, or is it staying at the same level we've always seen, but more people are being active. But it's now pretty clear that with people who have a long history of endurance exercise, there is at a point increased risk for dysrhythmias, primarily dysrhythmias. We don't see risk in the same way for things like coronary artery disease. So I think it's really important anytime this question comes up to point out that we know without a shadow of a doubt that exercise is ultimately good for the heart. So even though there may be some increased risk at a certain point for certain individuals, I don't ever want that conversation to dissuade someone from being active and enjoying endurance sports. But it appears that there's probably a bit of what we call a J-shaped curve with respect to the benefit imparted from exercise and endurance training. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends 150 minutes a week, which, I mean, that's a moderate ride for most of us, right? That's knocked out in an afternoon. So as you start to experience multiples of that, at first you see more and more benefit from a cardiac standpoint, and you reach a point at which that benefit starts to go away and the curve starts to go back up toward what your benefit or your risk would be at baseline if you're sedentary, and then presumably at some point you pass that. With respect to arrhythmias, there's a number of things that have to come into play, probably a genetic predisposition. Inflammatory load plays a role. If we look at someone like me, who was, I had a career as an emergency medicine doctor and worked nights and would sleep very little. And, there's a lot of inflammation and not much recovery. That probably plays a role. And so the reason I mentioned that is a lot of recreational athletes who get into very long endurance, Ironman and 100-mile gravel races. They're typically type A folks. They're working hard, they're living fast, they're enjoying life. They may drink a little too much. They may have smoked in the past. Like, there's all kinds of risk factors that come in. And so it's a cloudy picture. But I think it's important to say that, if you're doing something to that level, that intensity and that duration, it just means that the recovery is that much more important. There's nothing that says that if you're going to have a lifetime of endurance exercise, you're guaranteed to have dysrhythmias or other cardiac issues, but you do open up the possibility of slightly increased risk. So at the end of the day, it's about being smart, throwing in recovery, throwing in off weeks through the year, and making sure that you balance it all out. You're just not constantly pushing.
Thank you. You guys see any other questions that you would like to tackle? I actually am wondering about just a quick comment on weightlifting for cyclists. I think came up a couple times during the conversation. I think most cyclists, especially amateur riders, are just going out and riding, but what would you guys recommend for weightlifting, maybe in the off season?
So like Kevin said, a lot of cyclists are so scared of putting on weight, and I've definitely gotten like totally hooked on weightlifting the last 2 or 3 years. Kevin, I had that back surgery, and since I had then, I started lifting, and I feel almost better than ever in terms of balance, in terms of fitness, and I actually haven't put on that much weight. And so I feel like that was definitely something I missed out on in my career, because yeah, we would lift in the off season, but we never really lifted during the season for fear of putting on too much weight. But I don't think that's really an issue, especially if you're riding a lot. You're not going to put on all that muscle. And I do feel a difference in terms of general fitness. So I think I would definitely advocate that for an up and coming cyclist or somebody that is looking for different training techniques.
And just thinking about what cyclists do, we basically sit down all day long. We're either sitting down on our bicycle, we're in our office chair, or laying in bed. So bone mineral density becomes a big issue for cyclists. And the periodization part of weightlifting, I know of a lot of riders that do it the whole year. Maybe in the off season they're doing it 3 days a week. Before the classics, maybe taking it down to 2 days a week, and then maintenance of 1 day a week throughout the summer or when they can do it. But the biggest thing, we all know the normal leg exercises, but one of the biggest things that I saw both when I did it and didn't do it during my career, and what so many of the cyclists are concentrating on now, is core strength. Core supports, it's part of your power box. And if you have a weak core, it doesn't matter how strong your legs are, you're going to not be as efficient with delivering power to the pedals. So those, I think we all know, squats, deadlifts, things like this are, pretty stock standard, but the amount of core work and plyometric work that riders are doing now has definitely changed a lot since when we first started.
Yeah, and I think you can modulate through the course of the year doing the heavier training, heavy resistance training, traditional weight training, and then move into more of a core program. And I think core is often misunderstood. It's kind of shoulders to knees, and it's working on glutes, it's working on postural stability. It's they say you can't fire a cannon from a canoe, and if you've got none of that on the bike, you may have big quads, but you have nothing against which to push and create the power. And so there's a performance improvement from building that type of strength and stability. And there's also a longevity component, as George alluded to. And even just within the season, hopefully less injuries, but also just feeling better day to day and being able to tolerate a higher workload. So I would highly recommend that any cyclist work that into their program throughout the year.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. We're not going to be able to get to, we have lots of questions, but we are out of time. So I think what we're going to do is conclude the hour. I want to thank our three panelists for joining us for a really interesting conversation. Thanks, Bobby, George, and Kevin. And I think we are signing off at this point. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.